Hey everyone. It is good to be with you. It's good to see all of you. I feel like I know most of you. There's a few I don't. But hopefully we can correct that before we leave again. When Lee asked me a couple weeks ago if I'd be willing to preach, I thought, I did that last time. Surely they've learned their lesson by now. But he said it was your idea. And so all I could think was, it's been long enough they forgot what it was like. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be with you and to study with you from the Word. And I hope that there will be something that I can say. I was talking to Lee last night. I was like, what should I speak on? She's like, I've got this lesson out of Ezekiel. So we've been studying Ezekiel. So, okay, not that. I said something else. Gary preached on that last week. So not that. And so I think we have something that we've landed on. And so I hope the things that we study are biblical and are helpful to us all as we try to serve our Lord. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I had a Bible class teacher who was a little too optimistic about human nature, especially about the human nature of 8-year-old boys. And so she decided that everyone in the class was going to come up with a verse to learn. And so the next week, when it came time for us to recite the verses that we learned, the first two people she called on, they'd forgotten about the assignment completely. And just when I'm sure this teacher is thinking, this couldn't have gone any worse, my turn came. And now we have this preacher's son. Surely he has taken this assignment seriously. And so she calls on me, and I'm not proud of this. But I have chosen John 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. We weren't allowed to choose our own memory verses after that. we had to find a different system. And it's a shame that a verse that is known primarily for its length, rather than the profound message that it conveys to us. In this verse, we have the tears of God Himself. That should get our attention. God is crying. Why would that happen? What causes our God to weep? In fact, there are 3 cases that are recorded for us where Jesus wept. John 11:35, as we've mentioned, Luke chapter 19, verse 41, and then in Matthew 26, verses 37 and 38. Now we know from Isaiah chapter 53 that Jesus must have wept more than just these 3 times, because he's called the man of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. And so if you get the nickname man of sorrows, obviously you've done a lot of crying. They wouldn't call you that otherwise. But these are the 3 that the Holy Spirit has chosen to reveal to us. These 3 cases where Jesus wept. And so I want to spend time looking at these 3 passages and try to see what we can learn from these. Our question is, Jesus wept. Why? Why did Jesus weep? Why did Jesus weep? Well, first, in John 11:35, he weeps over his friend Lazarus, who had died. It tells us that Jesus had been in Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. We would call that Hanukkah. And so around November, December of the year, before he would die in the following March or April. And the Jews in Jerusalem did not respond very well to the teaching that he was doing. In fact, before you get to the end of John chapter 10, they've tried to kill him twice already. And so, chapter 10, verse 40, he goes away beyond the Jordan, he stays there. We don't know exactly how long he's there, but word comes back that he's urgently needed in Bethany, which is right outside Jerusalem, because Lazarus was sick. So, they send for him, John chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now, the problem with this is that Jesus knew what he was going to do when he got there. There was no question about what was going to happen. In fact, he says 4 times in chapter 11, this is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows it's going to be okay. Lazarus is going to be fine. And yet he weeps anyway. John chapter 11, verse 4, he says, this sickness is not unto death. He knows what's going to happen. Just as a side note, this is the same construction that you see in 1 John chapter 5, verse 16, where he talks about the sin that's unto death and the sin that's not unto death. And I think it's interesting that Jesus says, this sickness is not unto death. Lazarus died. He did actually die, even though it wasn't unto death. And so there's something there in 1 John. He's saying, sin will kill you. But if you have the right heart and you're willing to repent of it, you can come back to life. That's what happened to Lazarus. That's what I believe is happening in 1 John chapter 5. That's just thrown in for free. There's no extra charge for that point, but that's not what we're talking about this morning. John chapter 11, verse 11, he says, I'm going to wake Lazarus up. And, the apostles aren't getting it. Well, if he's asleep, there's really no need to go put your life in danger just to wake somebody up. And so he has to plainly tell them, no, he's dead. And I'm actually glad, verse 15, that this has happened. I'm glad that he has died, that you may believe. And so, and then finally, verse 23, he tells his sister, look, Lazarus is going to rise again. So before we even get to the cave, this man, and yet, when he gets there, Jesus wept. He's overcome with emotion at this scene. Why? Why does he weep? He knows it's going to be okay. Well, there are several possible solutions to this, and I've puzzled over this for years, and so I don't know that any one of them is definitive. I'm going to tell you where I've landed on this as we get to the end of it. But it could be, verse 33 in John chapter 11, he sees Mary weeping. And we know that he and Mary and Martha, and it's easy to see how when you're close to someone and you see them in terrible pain, terrible agony, that naturally you might have some emotions that are stirred by that. Is that why he weeps? I don't know. If he did, it would be following Romans chapter 12, verse 15, to weep with those who weep. And as our perfect example, it makes sense that he would do that. Is that why he wept? Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. Or does he look at this whole scene? Here is his friend that's died. His best 2 other friends are weeping over their brother. All these other mourners are there. Lazarus has presumably suffered before he died. That's usually what happens when you get sick. And he just weeps over the entire brokenness of the whole situation, of the whole world. If you go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 25, Jesus is standing here on this earth that he created. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 25, he's looking around at it. And it says, he looks at everything he's made. It was good. And you notice, when he gets down to verse 31, and the difference between verse 25 and verse 31 is that now man has been created. That's the difference between 25 and 31. Earth goes from good to very good, because now these creatures who are in the image of God, they're like God, walking around on the earth. Oh, now it's very good. And yet, now that you get to chapter 3, it's not so good anymore. And in fact, verses 17 to 19, the world is cursed because of man's sin. And in fact, 1 John chapter 5, verse 19 tells us that pretty much since day one, that's been the normal state of affairs. 1 John chapter 5, verse 19, we know that we're of God, and the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. It's been that way since Genesis 3. Is that why Jesus weeps here? That the world he created to be good, and even very good, is no longer good. It's broken. It's cursed. Is that why? Maybe. Maybe that's why. Or, in verse 36, is he weeping because of what he knows Lazarus went through before he died? That his friend suffered. Surely we don't like to see that happen. And that is, in fact, the conclusion that the crowd reaches when they see Jesus weeping. They say, see how he loved him. Oh, he's in such pain because Lazarus had to go through this. And the particle that they use there, the little word see, is the same word that in John chapter 1 verse 29 is translated behold. Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. That's what they're saying here. Behold how he loved him. And certainly he did love Lazarus. And loved him enough that he's willing to put himself at risk to go raise Lazarus from the dead. In chapter 11 verse 8, when he tells his disciples, well, I'm going to go back to Bethany, basically Jerusalem, and raise Lazarus, the disciples are basically saying, why? That's not a smart thing to do. You know they want to kill you, and you're going to go right there where they are. And chapter 11 verse 16, you for his doubt, probably unfairly, says, well, let's go so we can die with him. They are ready to do that. They're thinking, why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. This is a significant risk he's taking by going here. So yes, he did love Lazarus and he wanted what was best for him. And perhaps it's because Jesus knows, well, look, I could have prevented all this if I hadn't waited 4 days for him to die before I got there. And in that sense, he caused his suffering because he allowed him to die. He caused Mary and Martha's suffering because he didn't go take care of it before it happened. Is that why he wept? Maybe. Maybe. Or does he weep because Lazarus had to come back? Martha tells us that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Think about where Lazarus was during that time. Have you ever been on, say, a vacation that it was perfect? Everything went the best it possibly could have gone. It was relaxing. You had fun. You didn't have to think about anything unpleasant. And then you get back. And say it's Monday morning about 10:30. You've already kind of said hi to everybody at work and told them everything you're going to tell them. And now you're at your desk or at your station and you kind of, well, back to the grind. You've done that before? So imagine that times about 10 million. And I think I'm still undershooting it a great deal. Here, Lazarus has been in the best place anyone could possibly imagine, beyond our imagination, for 4 days. But now he's back. We know in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul had a similar experience to Lazarus. And he was in such spiritual danger from having that experience that God gave him a physical ailment, some kind of thorn in the flesh. We don't know what it was. Because of that spiritual danger, it placed him in. And so because he had experienced that glory, he had to be given something to try to keep him in check from letting him run away with pride or who knows what. Now he is in a similar situation. Is that why Jesus is weeping? Because he realizes, I have to do this. And Lazarus is going to be in some danger now because of what he has seen over these 4 days, and now I've got to bring him right back to this cursed world where he's in danger again. Is that why he wept? Maybe. Maybe. But where I've landed on this is that what we have here is an acted parable. And I know you all have been studying Ezekiel, and so you should know what an acted parable is. Some parables, as in the Gospels, are spoken mostly. Some are acted out. The most famous, I think, are in Ezekiel, where he he lays on his side for so many days, or he plays with toy soldiers around a model Jerusalem, or he cuts off his hair and cuts it up with a sword and throws it, and that sort of thing. I think that's what's going on here. That here we have an acted parable. Start reading. Look, notice in verse 40. Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then verses 41 and 42, they took away the stone, the place where he was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me, and I know that you by this, that they may believe that you sent me." Then, verses 43 and 44, he raises Lazarus from the dead. Verse 45, many of the Jews believe. And in fact, verse 48, the Pharisees get together and like, look, we've got to do something about this because everybody's going to believe on him when they hear about this. And so it's clear that his intent in doing this was to teach. He wanted people to learn from this. And that teaching was effective. He succeeded in what he was trying to do. But if we look at this as an active parable, I think this makes sense because here we have God's plan for the restoration of all mankind. Jesus comes, and before Lazarus is raised from the dead, he weeps. Only through the suffering of God can men be brought back to life. Only through the tears of God can we be raised from the death that plagues all of us. I think that's what he's doing here. Jesus wept, and then he brought back Lazarus back to life. Through his suffering, through the tears of God, will he bring us all to life. That's why I think Jesus wept. Second place we find Jesus weeping is over sinners who refused to believe on him. In Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 41. The context is the Jesus triumphal day of the week before he dies. And people are shouting. They're taking palm leaves and laying them down in front of his donkey as he rides in. They're taking their clothes and putting them down. And Jesus knows how important this occasion is because, some of the Pharisees are standing there, verses 39 and 40, and say, look, you can't let them be saying these things. And he responds to them, look, if they don't say it, these rocks are going to start shouting. And so he knows how important this occasion is. This is the most glory he receives from men during his earthly ministry. There's nothing else that compares to this. And in the midst of this scene, we call it the triumphal entry, starts weeping, starts crying. Verses 41 through 44, he saw the city and he wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Days will come upon you, and your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. His focus here is on what they don't know. If only you knew what was coming. If only you knew what was about to happen to you, you could avoid this. You could stop it. He delivered this message on a number of occasions. In Luke chapter 13, as he's making this final journey, he is using what I would call bitter sarcasm. Luke chapter 13, verse 33. Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. Now, plenty of prophets died outside of Jerusalem. That's not his point. I mean, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Deborah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, probably. A lot of them died outside of Jerusalem. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that this is Jerusalem's favorite thing to do. If you're a prophet and you want to die, go to Jerusalem and start preaching. They'll probably kill you. And he's not going to be any exception to this. Verse 35, surely I say to you, you shall not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Verse 34, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her house, to gather you, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. Here the focus is on what they didn't want to know. Not just what they didn't know, but what they didn't want to know. They didn't want to know the things that made for their peace. This makes clear. He wants them to repent. He wants them to avoid this. But they don't want it. They don't want it. And he's weeping in this case. He knows what's coming. He knows what's coming. Matthew chapter 23, verses 34 through 39, we see the same thing again. This is inside the city later that week as he leaves the temple, probably on Wednesday. Here, it's not just that they don't know, but they don't want it. They don't want it. They have repudiated him. Trying to tell them what they need to do is a good way to get yourself killed. That's what's going to happen to them. He has told them things they don't want to know. So they're going to kill him. Why cry over this, though? I mean, it's not coming. I mean, they richly deserve everything that is going to happen to them. Too many people have this concept of God as, he's just waiting there and he wants to punish sinners. And they look at the judgments of the Old Testament and think, oh, yep, that's how God is. He wants people to suffer because they didn't obey him, and they deserve every bit of that. And passages like Psalm chapter 7, verse 11, God is angry with the wicked every day. Yes, that's true. God's completely morally right. And so the only response he can have to sin is indignation over it. But that doesn't mean he somehow takes pleasure in having to mete out justice, that's some fun thing for him to do. It's not that he wants to do it, and that's clear even in the Old Testament. No pleasure in the death of the wicked. I don't want this, but you make me do it. Here Jesus goes further even than that. It's one thing to say, I don't really like something. Jesus actively weeps over what's going to happen here. God weeps that his creation has turned against him. They've turned their back on it. They refuse to listen. Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, he spells out what's going to happen. 24, verse 21, there will be great tribulation, such as there has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. This is going to be bad. It's going to be awful what happens in Jerusalem. And that's just the earthly penalty these people are going to pay. That's not to mention what's going to happen to these people in eternity because they've rejected it. The doctrine of hell is probably the hardest concept for most people to accept, especially if you're talking to your friends. People can get on board with God as love, right? That's not hard for people to get a hold of. People can get a hold of Christ loves you so much, he gave himself for you. That, again, is easier to grasp than this idea that, there's some people who've rejected God, they're going to spend an eternity in hell. That bothers me. In fact, there was an atheist who showed up in my Bible class about 10 years ago on a Wednesday night. And, we're going through, I think it was Deuteronomy at the time. And we didn't get much Deuteronomy done that night because it was one thing after another. And he actually came to our services for a while, I think mostly because he liked to argue. But the one thing that he just kept saying is that I just don't understand how you can believe this. That God is going to torture people for eternity. Oh. And I think he speaks for a lot of people when he says things like that. Why not just let us go? Just annihilate me. Just make me nothing at all. And what I tried to get him to understand is that God is planning to let you go. But to annihilation is to commit what they call category error. The way we usually say that is, well, you're comparing apples and oranges, which is not the best example because you can compare apples and oranges, right? They're both fruits, they're round, they're growing trees, they're kind of sweet. But what we're saying when we say that, it's more like criticizing an apple for not being an orange. People criticize hell as being a bad alternative to annihilation. But it's not. It can't be an alternative to annihilation. It's that how would I, if I did not exist, profit by not existing? You see, you can't compare being and non-being in that way. We are all made in the image of God. And when we are made, He imbues each of us with the same immortality of spirit that He has. The same agency that allows Him to create us, He gives to us, which allows us to reject Him. He will not have it another way. He cannot unmake us once we are made. All He can do is fully, finally leave us alone. And that is what He will do. And He must do that in order to protect the innocent. The other thing I kept pointing out to this guy is like, look, you think this life is all there is. And so, I don't know what the difference is between you, when you say we ought to lock up murderers for the rest of their life, and God when He does the same thing. I mean, we're just going to go get the keys out and let these people loose? No. That would be misery for everybody else who's out on the outside who didn't do anything wrong. And so people agree in principle that, yes, to protect the innocent, we have to segregate those people. Prisons are terrible places. I used to represent people who didn't pay their child support. And the interesting, and you can go to jail for not doing that. And the interesting thing to me is that people who were homeless, I mean, guys who were literally living under bridges, preferred that to being in jail. It was that bad. And this was just county jail. This wasn't prison. And so, you know, one of the worst places on earth are these prisons, and we create them. And everybody agrees that we should. Even, I mean, there's a few people on the fringes that, you know, maybe we ought to just let people go and not worry about it. But most people agree, yeah, we got to lock people up to protect the innocent. We don't want murderers walking around able to do that again. That's what God is going to do. All He can do is fully, finally leave us alone. But He doesn't rejoice in this. God weeps over sinners who reject Him. And then number 3. Jesus wept over the price that He was going to pay. Matthew chapter 26, verses 37 and 38. Here Jesus has entered the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing in just a few hours He's going to be on the cross. And He was in for the worst night of His life. I mean, just about everything that could go wrong that night had already done so. And the next day is going to be even worse than that. And so verses 37 and 38, it says He began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. He says, I am exceedingly sorrowful, even unto... I can't absolutely prove that He cried on this occasion, but I think I'm on fairly safe ground saying that He did. Luke chapter 22, verse 44 tells us that He was so distressed in this moment that the capillaries underneath His skin burst open and blood started coming out with His sweat. I have never been that overcome with emotion that actually started bleeding through my pores. But I would suspect that crying comes a good deal before that, before you get to that point. So I'm going to say that He cried here. If you don't agree, that's fine. You can come talk to me about it. But I'm going to say that He did. So here in this garden, God cries. Why? Well, for the same reason that He cried on these other occasions. He cries at the brokenness of this world that only his suffering can redeem. He cries of the curse of sin that brought death into the world. And that curse must now belong to him. He has to die for sinners who don't even appreciate it. Even those closest to him at this time, as soon as the guards show up, they're out of there. He is absolutely alone, going through this for people, one, who mostly don't understand it, and two, that mostly actively reject him. They don't want it. That's why they're killing it. Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, tries to impress upon us how amazing this is. Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse 6. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, that we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more than having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. The best that Paul can do to describe everybody at this point, the enemy of Christ. All of us, enemies. And that's what he's willing to do. That would make me a little sad if I had to die for someone who was my enemy. The cost of sin always has been a life. That's why in Genesis, Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Cain's wasn't. He offered a life. In fact, it wasn't just a life. It was required. But a perfect life. Before the old law was even given. Here, the Israelites are still in Egypt. In Exodus chapter 12. Before they even leave, God sets up this Passover, and he tells them it has to be a lamb without blemish. Without blemish. The only thing that can cause God to overlook sin is a perfect life. The last sacrifice, as noted in Hebrews chapter 9, was the same. Hebrews chapter 9, beginning in verse 11. Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood. He entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh. How much more, so the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit, offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And for this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of transgressions under the first covenant, that those may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. That's always been the cost. And that's what was paid. More amazing than the tears of God is to save us. 1 John chapter 4, verse 16 tells us that God is love. That's his nature. A selfish person is focused inward. You guys have probably met somebody like that, right? They only kind of care about themselves. They have this little orbit that they stay in, and it is focused inward. They're only interested in you, generally, to the extent they can get something out of you for themselves. Love is the opposite of that. It revolves around others, around those around you. It changes a person. You sacrifice for people you love. People don't even realize sometimes the sacrifices that are made within families because you love them. They don't even seem like it because you love them. Fathers work 2, 3 jobs because they love their children. They love their wife. Wives spend hours awake when they would rather be asleep because they love their children. You do that for people you love. Instead of revolving around yourself, you revolve around those people. You see to their needs. When a person says, I love you, what he's saying is, I will change for you. I'll orbit, not myself, but you. If God is love, then that process has been happening since eternity. It's always been going on. that I think is one reason he reveals himself not just as a single entity, but as three. That's the only time you can have love, is that there is more than one person. And so this process of orbiting one another has been going on through eternity. And in fact, Jesus tells us that's the case. Go to John chapter 17. John chapter 17 in verse 20. I don't pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. And the glory which you gave me, I have given them, that they may be one, just as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and loved them as you have loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you gave me, they may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory, which you have given me, for you loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you. And these have known that you sent me, and I have declared to them your name, and will declare it, that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in them. This has always been going on. Jesus came here to give us the only thing that will make us happy. Perfect unity with who made us and in whose image we are made. That is the only thing that can do it. The sun now orbits the earth. He changed into the form of one of us to accommodate us in the hope that we will choose to love him back and thus be eternally happy. Jesus wept over what that cost him, but he did it anyway. That is our choice. We can be eternally happy, loving God, changing for him, orbiting him, doing his will, or we can spend the rest of our eternity in a prison of our own making, trapped in selfishness and despair, and continuing that downward spiral for eternity. I don't know what better describes hell than that. A person that just continues to get worse and worse and worse as that soul crushes in on itself, and that goes on for 1 million years, 10 million years. It never stops. That is hell, brother. Jesus wept because he loves us. You know, with some people, tears are a substitute for action. You ever know anybody like that? You know, they just feel terrible about something, and they'll cry about it, but they won't do anything. You know, you can fix this. No, it's hopeless. And they cry about it, but they do nothing. They do nothing. Jesus has shown us a better way. He doesn't merely cry over these things. He did something about it. He has seen to it that we will never have to cry again. He will wipe away every tear from our eyes if we'll follow him. His terms are simple. They're easy. Mark chapter 16, verse 16, he who believes and is baptized, he's saved. He who doesn't believe, he'll be condemned. It's your choice. Romans chapter 6, verse 4 tells us that we can be buried with him in baptism. We can to walk in newness of life, orbiting him, changing for him, being like him. I don't know your condition this morning. I don't know whether you have done that or not. I would encourage you to. It's better than any other alternative you have. If you realize that you've kind of started to turn in on yourself, that, well, you know, I've been selfish, I've been seeking what I want rather than what God wants. You can change that. You can get that straightened out. Even as a Christian, you can repent. And so we're going to stand and sing this song to encourage anyone who wants to follow Christ to do so this morning. If you're subject to temptation, please come as we stand and sing.